the Northern Neck National Heritage Area and Northern Neck 250 Coalition, welcome to the final event in this year's Signature Speaker Series. This is the third year of programming as part of a 4-year commemoration of the birth of our nation, and our theme this year is the American Experiment. From the beginning, the leaders of the founding era understood they were launching something unprecedented, a bold experiment in representative government and constitutional liberty. They knew that success would depend not only on their generation, but on those that followed. They entrusted that experiment to us, expecting that each generation would preserve it, test it, and strive to improve it. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the nation's founding, we have a rare opportunity to reflect on the origins of our institutions and civic life, and to consider how every generation has shaped, strengthened, and challenged the American experiment. Today, Dr. Kathleen Bartoloni-Tuazon joins us to explore the presidential title controversy of 1789. In her talk today, Dr. Bartoloni-Tuazon will illuminate the intricacies of a debate over a seemingly small but vitally important question in our nation's history: what to call our president. Before we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones and hold any question until the end of her presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much.
Sure, Dr. Kathleen Bartoloni-Tuazon is an expert on the early presidency and a thought leader in her field. She received her doctorate from George Washington University and found a welcome intellectual environment at the first Federal Congress project in Washington, D.C., where she was visiting scholar, contributing to a project to document all of the material related to America's first Congress under the new Constitution, which is now a part of the Washington National Library at Mount Vernon in Virginia. She's been interviewed by National Public Radio and has had opinion pieces in The Economist and the Boston Globe. She has appeared several times on C-SPAN and lectures on the presidency, the evolution of executive power, and the Washington administration. She is the author of For Fear of an Elective King, a book that richly details how the question of the president's title became a defining moment for our country and for executive legitimacy. And her book has been recommended by sources as varied as Vanity Fair, Presidential Studies Quarterly, the Journal of the Early Republic, and the American Historical Review. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathleen Bartoloni-Tuazon.
Thanks so much for being here today. And thank you, Lisa, for that lovely and generous introduction. And happy Flag Day. Isn't this a great room? I mean, it's not usually open. I was here yesterday. I can tell you it was closed. So we're very lucky to have this opportunity to enjoy ourselves in the space today. I'm honored to be here to help you celebrate the 250th year celebration of our Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. America was an experiment, and today we're going to talk about the very first year and the very first weeks and months of George Washington's presidency under an untested and untried Constitution. As you see from the title of my talk today, we're going to be talking about the presidential title controversy of 1789. This story, as I said, is of the early presidency, of Washington's first administration and first months in office, and the country's struggle with and cautious acceptance of the presidency and executive power. In the early spring of 1789, and within weeks of the first session of Congress, a dispute erupted over how to address the president. This was actually the very first dispute between the Senate and the House about constitutional intent. So the title controversy, which you might think was frivolous or inconsequential, and it certainly wasn't taxes, was the very first time they had to talk about constitutional intent and interpret what the Constitution meant. So the Senate majority favored a lofty title equal to world leaders, who are all kings, and also grander than state governors. However, the House stood loudly and unanimously opposed to any title for the president other than what was named in the Constitution, that of president. The controversy over a presidential title began in Congress on the day that Washington arrived in New York City on April 23rd, 1789, a week before his inauguration on April 30th. The legislative phase of the controversy lasted 3 weeks. So there were 3 weeks where the Senate and the House basically did almost nothing else except argue about a title for the president. But the title controversy actually had 2 phases. The legislative phase, which was fierce, and then a prolonged public phase, which lasted all summer and into the fall of 1789. During the public phase, it seemed that almost everyone had an opinion about titles. I'll bet you all have an opinion about titles. From newspapers to letters to other forms of communication, you see a wide range of opinions. Remember, the Senate at that time met behind closed doors. So even news about this dispute didn't really reach the public, except through some rumors, until the title controversy was resolved within the legislature on May 14th. And then it was published about a week later, and everybody was like, what? There was this dispute about a title, and we're just now hearing about it? Well, we have something to say about it, and that's what happened all summer long and into the fall. Okay. Could I have the next slide? Thank you. So what was the title controversy, and what does it tell us? Congress, the press, and individuals throughout the country debated more than 30 titles for the president, most with royal overtones, especially various forms of highness and majesty. In a world full of monarchs, the eventual resolution of the title controversy in favor of the simple President of the United States remained far from certain. The resolution, the simple title of president, was a relief to the vast majority of Americans who still remembered the American Revolution fought against the British King George III. The Constitution set no term limits for the president, and so many people worried that the president would become like an all-powerful king. Others worried that he would become a weak, corruptible king, too weak or too strong. With no term limits, he'd stay in office too long. In fact, one of the main criticisms of the presidency during the ratification debates was lodged by anti-federalists from Pennsylvania. This group of anti-federalists called themselves collectively an old Whig. These critics of the proposed Constitution worried that a president would become like a king of the worst kind, an elective king. An elective king. So the question of executive leadership within a popular sovereignty, where the people vote for the president and their representatives, was a complicated one, and the presidency was a very controversial position. The Revolutionary War had been fought against George III, King George III, yet 6 years later, after the Treaty of Paris and the end of the war, this untried constitution featured a very broadly defined singular central executive for whom some in Congress contemplated grand titles. And there were no term limits on the president. So it's no wonder that the office alarmed critics of the Constitution because of its resemblance to monarchy. Thus, we see that fear expressed by an old Whig that the president would become an elective king. To make matters worse, in addition to the no term limits, the vaguely defined powers of the president led to conflicting interpretations of dangerous strength or disastrous weakness. The new presidency forced Americans to find an acceptable balance between elite executive power and the people's sovereignty. Next slide. So just what kind of president did the people of the country want and need? The fight over a presidential title was hardly frivolous. Even though the Senate eventually agreed with the House on the simple title of president after fighting for 3 weeks over it, the Senate actually went on record recommending, quote, His Highness, the President of the United States and protector of their liberties. Let me repeat that. His Highness, the President of the United States and protector of their liberties. Even before George Washington arrived in New York City, questions began to circulate about how to address Washington as president. He had held the title of His Excellency as Commander-in-Chief of the Revolutionary Forces and retained that title as well as his military title as General. He already was addressed as Excellency or General all the time by just about everyone. What to call him as president, especially since Excellency and Honorable were already being used by state governors. As the inauguration neared, anticipation of Washington's presidency fed the uproar about a title. George Washington was universally trusted, and as a result, was an ideal choice for the presidency. He was the most popular American political personality of his time, perhaps any time. Washington's very popularity, however, complicated perceptions of the presidency and the office of the national executive. Washington's incredible celebrity represented both a blessing and a curse for the presidency. He was the unanimous choice, trusted by all, but his enormous popularity actually threatened the presidency with monarchical overtones. Everywhere he went, parades, dinners, and other displays of adoration followed, much like the progresses of the kings of Europe. Considering his popularity, it's no wonder that one of the titles considered was the title of Washington. As president, Washington would help Americans feel secure about the office. So why not title the office with his name, like Caesar did in imperial Rome? But those who dreaded anything more than a simple title did not want an imperial president. Did George Washington fight against the king in order to have a crown of his own? And yet, there was a case to be made on the other side. Many Americans believed a strong title would guard against the risk of a weak executive becoming the corrupt tool of a powerful few, like Senate elites or foreign powers. Next slide. This painting captures the popular enthusiasm for Washington, an enthusiasm that elicited a kind of rapture in the people. This painting by Orsine Rivey shows Washington's arrival in New York City on April 23rd, a week before his inauguration. The artist actually did a fairly accurate job of showing Washington's elegant barge on which he rode as he approached the city from the Hudson River. The artist's romantic, sentimental, and a little naive style actually captures the joy of the welcoming crowd. When you read about it, everyone talks about how joyous it was that day. Notice the red, white, and blue of the president's barge. The red canopy, the 13 white-clad oarsmen representing the 13 states, and George Washington in a blue suit. The color of the canopy also suggests the royal red of kings and has a bit of a majestic look. George Washington's arrival was a huge event. Loads of cannon fire and people, red carpet on the steps of the wharf. There was a flotilla of boats dotting the Hudson River, following alongside his barge. It was so noisy that a school of porpoises surfaced in the river and followed the barge as if to see what was going on and be a part of the celebration. Here we have George Washington's inaugural suit. It was more than just a piece of clothing. It was his statement about national identity and one of Washington's many attempts to downplay his celebrity. He was very careful to choose to wear a simple but elegantly tailored, domestically produced outfit for the inauguration. Ever conscious of his role as the nation's first leader, but at the same time trying to make his role of president seem less threatening, his coat was crafted from American high-quality wool from the Hartford Woolen Manufactory in Connecticut. Once the fabric arrived at Mount Vernon, it is believed that his indentured tailor, Caven Boa, created the inaugural suit according to Washington's specifications. And we know that this was a conscious decision on Washington's part, since he wrote, "I shall always take a peculiar pleasure in giving every popular and proper encouragement in my power to the manufactures of my country." So you could say that George Washington was the first major statesman to promote American made. Next slide. This is a hand-colored engraving of Federal Hall from the time, done by Amos Doolittle in 1790. Both the Senate and the House met here. If you look closely, you can see that depiction of Federal Hall in New York City shows Washington's inauguration in April of 1789, where they stood on the balcony in view of the public. I'd like to take this moment to make a little aside here. You know, there are several tragedies in the world of historical conservation. One of them is that George Washington's home birthplace no longer exists. Archaeological excavations have helped us know more about what Washington's birthplace may have looked like, and thanks so much to the people here for making this a priority. Another tragedy is that Federal Hall, incredibly, no longer exists. It was on Wall Street in New York. That's not what's going on there these days. There is a building there that was built during the Greek revival period of the 1840s, and it's called Federal Hall, and it's a museum and a memorial, but the original is gone, and drawings like this, of which there are just a few from this time, are probably the closest we're ever going to come. Okay, next. An important voice on the side of arguing for a regal title for the president was John Adams. He was Washington's vice president and also president of the Senate. Adams worried that an American aristocracy could emerge from the Senate or other elites that would somehow overwhelm the new national leader, much as a royal court could manipulate its king. As far as Adams was concerned, the best way to guard against that would be a grand title for the president. America's governors already held the titles of Excellency and Honorable, so the president's title would have to be grander. For Adams, nothing would do but Highness, most benign Highness, or Majesty. With this stance, despite some legitimate worries about the possible corruption of a president, Adams alarmed his revolutionary cohorts, lost political influence, and came to be known as a tacit monarchist, when really he was more like anti-elitist. He even earned a derisive title of his own, his rotundity, among his colleagues in the Senate, whispered more than once, definitely. And among the people, he was known by another title, the dangerous vice. Next slide. Here we have someone you know pretty well down here. This is Richard Henry Lee, Senator Richard Henry Lee from Virginia. He supported Adams in his quest for a grand title. They were great friends, but Richard Henry Lee had been an anti-federalist and a critic of the Constitution. So when he supported Adams and grand titles, he confused his colleagues. But Lee feared the Senate elites overpowering the president, much as Adams did. Lee had been ill-used a few times by Virginia Senate elites, and elite power and the concerns about the growth of elite power started very early in our nation's history. And he was one who, although he had criticized the Constitution, advocated for a grand title. In fact, on April 23rd, when Washington arrived, on that day, Congress met, and it was Lee who proposed that they discuss an official title for the president. Because it wasn't Adams, he was the president of the Senate. He could not do anything but listen. So Lee was the one who actually started this dispute. Next slide, please. The loudest and often lone voice in the Senate against grand titles was Senator William McClay of Pennsylvania. He wanted no title other than what was named in the Constitution, that of president. We learn much about the title controversy from his perspective in a detailed diary that he kept. Their barely civil confrontations between Adams and McClay are the things of high drama. McClay considered Adams his nemesis. He called Adams in his diary a monkey just put into breeches, and blamed him for this whole idolatrous business of titles. McClay hated grand titles and all the royal connotations it brought with it, and he believed he had the public on his side, which he did. A majority of Americans did not agree with Adams. Next slide, please. In the House, Virginia Representative James Madison and all of his colleagues opposed a high title for the president. And the House was very firm. In all the committees that met during that 3 weeks, in various arguments that were made on the floor, the House was adamantly and unanimously opposed to anything other than president. Something that's somewhat unknown and underappreciated about George Washington's first year as president is that James Madison served as Washington's closest collaborator during this time and often functioned as Washington's public voice. As president, Washington stepped away from any kind of arguments going on in Congress. And as a result, if you listen to Madison during that first year in particular, you do hear what he was getting from Washington. Their close relationship during this time really does offer a lot of clues in addition to the title controversy. For example, in the letter to Thomas Jefferson that was coded, he actually coded some of his letters. Madison hinted at the depth of the president's relief at the outcome of the simple title of president instead of a regal one. Madison wrote, "Had the project succeeded, it would have subjected the president to a severe dilemma and given a deep wound to our infant government." So Washington didn't interfere in the debate directly, but he expressed his own relief in a letter to his son-in-law, David Stewart, after Congress adopted the title of president. Washington exclaimed, "Happily, the matter is now done with. I hope never to be revived." Next slide. During the title controversy, Adams suffered a misery of the slings and arrows of critical opinion. He was the butt of jokes among his colleagues and called his rotundity. And even more damaging and widespread among the people, he became known as the dangerous vice, a title derived from a long poem by Edward Church entitled "The Dangerous Vice, ." Notice that the number of dashes are the exact number to spell out the word president. The dangerous vice president. This was a very popular poem. It was published in the summer of 1789 and appeared throughout the states. And it linked the evils of the vice of monarchy with Vice President Adams, the titles champion, only a heartbeat away from the presidency. In the same poem, George Washington is depicted as a hero with no vices and extolled for his unblemished honor. The contrast between the evils of monarchy, represented by Adams, and the blessings of liberty, represented by Washington, could not have been starker. Next slide. So attitude toward the presidency remained unresolved in 1789. Americans sought a clearer understanding of their new national leader before they could accept the power implied by the office. The debate in Congress and among the people resolved somewhat unfinished questions that had been raised about the presidency and presidential authority during the ratification debates. And the resolution of the controversy in favor of the simple title of President of the United States relieved many concerns. Through Washington's example, the people became more comfortable with the presidency. In Washington, people tended to see what they wanted to see. And the presidency, therefore, was secure as long as the office was occupied by their idol. Throughout the controversy, Washington himself suffered no damage to his reputation. He remained everyone's ideal. John Adams suffered a blow to his reputation, as we've seen. But more importantly, and very significantly, one of the legacies of the presidential title controversy is the casualty of the professional relationship of the presidency to the vice presidency, and as a result, a consolidation of executive authority in the president. Washington's trust in Adams and his political instincts was diminished by Adams's promotion of a regal title. So Washington backed away from the vice president. For example, Washington rarely asked for Adams' advice in the coming years. And in fact, Adams was never invited by Washington to attend any of the cabinet meetings. So as a result, a diminished vice presidency became a long-term consequence of the title controversy, apparent even today. Next slide. And so, because of this reduced emphasis on the vice presidency, the ultimate legacy of the title controversy, in addition to the people's increased comfort with the office of the president, is actually an expansion and consolidation of executive power within the limits that governing within a popular sovereignty brings. Foremost of those limits are the people's demand for power coupled with restraint, which they got with the simple title of president. In addition, the people sought an acknowledgement of their will, evident by Washington's opposition to a grand title. If he had wanted a grand title, it probably would have happened. This portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart in 1796 depicts a studiously and overtly Republican President Washington standing in his plain suit with his hand on what may be the Constitution. It sent a message of power, coupled with modesty and a reference to the people. This modesty, which signaled restraint in the executive and the acknowledgement of the people's will, constitute, I believe, Washington's first principles of presidential leadership. Power coupled with restraint and a nod of recognition and reassurance to the people. Other paintings of the president from this period convey a similar ideal of presidential leadership. Washington's continued popularity stemmed from his ability to understand and reflect the pulse of popular opinion. The title of Mr. President, so commonly heard today at press conferences, never attached to Washington, who continued to be addressed as General and Excellency for the rest of his life. Mr. President, however, because of the title controversy, would be the way of the future, not just as a formal title, but also as a guiding notion for how to organize the trappings of the office. Some would say that the modern presidency, basically from the 20th century on, has moved beyond these principles of modesty and restraint. However, I think that the effort that some modern presidents have gone to appear like one of us, whether it's playing the saxophone, hating broccoli, clearing brush, or playing basketball, all of these traits harken back to the principle of modesty and simplicity, although in today's parlance, it's often called relatability. Next. So one of the things that we learn from the title controversy is that the question of executive leadership within a popular sovereignty is a tricky proposition. Today, accusations of and concerns about an imperial presidency continue a long-standing inclination toward protectiveness and concern toward the office that started with the title controversy, and attest to how hard it is to determine the proper role of an increasingly formidable type of world leader. As you can see, the title of my book is For Fear of an Elective King. It is taken from a term first used by an old Whig, an anti-federalist critic during the debates over the ratification of the Constitution. When I was doing my research and writing this book, I never dreamed that there would be nationwide No Kings protests aimed at the American president that would involve millions of people like we've seen in the last year. On the one hand, I was surprised. But on the other hand, as I thought about it, I'm not surprised at all. After doing this research, I realized that the American people really do deeply care about the kind of president they have. Interestingly, modesty and restraint in the interpretation of his executive power, Washington's first principles of presidential leadership, do not define the main traits of our country's current president. It was unsettled time in 1789. The Constitution and our government were new and untested. Today, we seem to still be in unsettled times. Perhaps throughout our history, our times have always been unsettled. Think about it. Wars, civil wars, world wars, marches and protests for lots of different things. Perhaps this unsettled nature is the nature of democracy. So, thank you so much for listening today. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Lisa. And I would be glad to answer any questions you might have at this time. Thanks again.